Picture this. It's 1991, and India, a nation of nearly a billion people, is standing on the very edge of an economic cliff. The decisions made in that single year wouldn't just pull it back from the brink, they would completely rewrite its future. So, how did India get there? And what did it take to transform a nation that was on the verge of total collapse?
It's a pretty dramatic question, isn't it? But back in 1991, it was a terrifyingly real possibility for India. The country was staring down an economic crisis like nothing it had ever seen before. But what does that actually mean for a country of that size?
It means this. India's foreign exchange reserves, the hard currency like US dollars that it needs to buy essentials like oil from other countries, had pretty much vanished. The country had just enough money left to pay for less than 2 weeks of imports. After that, the whole system would just stop.
So, how on earth did things get so dire? Well, a crisis like this doesn't just pop up overnight. You can actually trace its roots all the way back to how the economy was managed in the 1980s. You can think of it like a personal budget that has spiraled completely out of control, just on a massive national scale. The government was spending way more than it was bringing in through taxes. It was buying a lot more stuff from other countries than it was selling to them, which was just draining its foreign currency. And at home, prices for everyday things were shooting through the roof. It got so bad that eventually no other country, no international funder was willing to lend India another dime.
With literally no other options left, India had to turn to the world's emergency lenders, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. They had to ask for a massive $7 billion loan just to keep the lights on and avoid defaulting on their payments.
But here's the thing, a loan like this always comes with strings attached. These international agencies said, sure, we'll help, but you have to fundamentally change how your economy works. And that pressure led to the announcement of a new economic policy, which was built on 3 huge core ideas. These 3 steps, liberalization, privatization, and globalization, often just called the LPG reforms, were the absolute heart of this new policy. They represented a massive shift away from the economic path India had been on for decades. So let's break down what each one really meant.
Okay, first up, liberalization. In simple terms, this was all about unshackling the Indian economy. For decades, you had this incredibly complex web of rules and regulations, a ton of red tape that controlled almost every part of doing business. The whole point of liberalization was to get out the scissors and start cutting through it. And the scale of this change was just enormous. Before 1991, India had what was called the license Raj. An entrepreneur needed government permission for pretty much everything, from starting a company to deciding how much of a product to make. But after the reforms, industrial licensing was just gone for most industries. The private sector was suddenly encouraged, and prices, well, they were now set by the market, not by a government official.
The second pillar was privatization. This one's pretty straightforward. It meant the government was going to reduce its role by selling off ownership in state-run companies to private buyers. The whole idea, known as disinvestment, was to bring in private money and management to try and make these companies more efficient and, frankly, more profitable.
And the third pillar, globalization. This was all about opening India's doors to the rest of the world. It meant getting rid of restrictions on trade and foreign investment. The goal was to plug India into the global economy and make it more competitive on the world stage.
And a huge, visible outcome of this was the rise of outsourcing. As global communication got better and cheaper, companies in the West started hiring Indian firms for things like IT support and customer service. Why? Because India had this massive pool of skilled, English-speaking workers who could do the job for a fraction of the cost.
So, that was the grand plan. The big question is, did it work? Now, more than 3 decades later, what does the report card look like? Let's start with the successes.
Well, the number everyone points to is the massive jump in GDP growth. The economy's growth rate shot up from around 5.6% in the decade before the reforms to a blistering 8.2% in the late 2000s. And the really crucial thing to see here is that this explosion in growth was overwhelmingly driven by the services sector.
Opening up the economy also unleashed a flood of foreign investment. It went from just about $100 million in 1990 to a staggering $30 billion by 2017. That's a game changer.
And hey, remember that critical shortage of foreign cash that started this whole mess?
By 2018, India's foreign exchange reserves had ballooned from just $6 billion to over $413 billion. It became one of the largest reserve holders in the entire world.
But that incredible growth story has a catch. While the headline numbers look amazing, critics argue that the benefits haven't really been shared equally across all parts of the economy or all of its people.
And this is really the core of the criticism. A lot of scholars point out that even with that rapid GDP growth, it just didn't create enough jobs for India's huge and growing workforce. People started calling it jobless growth.
And when you look closer, you see some real areas of concern. The industrial sector actually slowed down, partly because it was now competing with cheaper imported goods. But the biggest hit, arguably, was felt in agriculture. Government investment in things like irrigation fell, and getting rid of subsidies on things like fertilizer hit small farmers really, really hard.
This isn't just an abstract economic problem. Take the story of Mahadeva, a groundnut farmer in Andhra Pradesh. With subsidies cut, his costs went up. At the same time, because of the reforms, the market was flooded with cheap imported cooking oils. The result? He found he couldn't even sell his own crops for a price that would cover what he spent to grow them.
That whole policy of privatization has also drawn a lot of fire. Critics argued that government-owned assets were often sold off for way less than they were worth. And what's more, the money that came in from those sales was often used just to plug holes in the government's annual budget instead of being invested in new infrastructure or development projects.
So we're left with this really big question. There is no doubt that the 1991 reforms saved India from economic collapse and unleashed incredible growth, but they also created brand new challenges and deepened inequalities. Decades later, the debate still rages on. Did this revolution build an economy that really works for everyone?